When you look at suppression of information within the United States, as an example, it was, I think, in the 90s, up to 40% of the Air Force equipment budget was classified. In other words, it was black. It was so black that nobody knew what it was. 40% of the equipment budget in the Air Force is billions and billions of dollars. When you look at advanced research in terms of how it comes forward, usually what comes out in the public is about 20 years behind where we're at. When you look at all of the history of the United States and the way in which we built our security and military apparatus, including every other nation, that's how they operate. We compartmentalize, we separate deliberately, we break it down into small components, which is very expensive and results in a lot of duplication. But at the end of the day, you get something that is really well hidden. I mean, what we learn about the human body and brain when it has weapons applications and the research is funded by the military, don't think it's being done for medical science. The military in our country doesn't fund medical research. That's somebody else, unless it has a specific weapons application or a specific use within the Veterans Administration. And Veterans Administration is often used to test new ideas, to test new concepts. So our servicemen get the experiment of war and then get the experiment after the fact. Even in the MK Ultra releases of information in the 19s, from the 60s and the early 70s, over 4,000 men and women that they admit in the U.S. military were used as experimental subjects without fully informed consent. Secretary of Energy O'Leary under the Clinton administration said over 500,000 Americans have been used in human experiments over 4 decades, mind control and other experiments, without their informed consent. 500,000 people they admit to, and no one's been put on trial for that. No one's been held accountable for that. I think most Americans find that highly objectionable, that no one's been held accountable for invading the very essence of who they are as human beings. That's the problem. It's been going on 40 years. It continues to today under the guise of increased security for what? If you don't have freedom of thought foundationally, what the heck are we securing and for whom? This is really where the science of mind effects has gone over the last several decades, to that kind of precision, using any electromagnetic carrier. In fact, there's a great article produced by the U.S. Army War College. It was in their quarterly perimeters back, I think it was 98, winter of 98 or 99. But the article is easy to find. It's called "The Mind Has No Firewalls," which is a reiteration of a Russian military journal talking about all the different ways, and essentially any electromagnetic carrier, whether it's the internet, television, radio, or these larger systems like HAARP, or something more directional, oriented towards an individual, can alter mental states, behaviors, even planning particular thoughts or ideas within the consciousness of individuals. Any electromagnetic carrier can be used. You can use the power grid, you can use the internet, telephone, any wireless system can be overridden with a signal. In fact, during the first Gulf conflict, the first Gulf War of Bush 1, they actually, Scottish media reported after the effects of exactly this kind of technology. And we used a project called Project Solo, where we had this plane crammed full of electronic apparatus. And what it does is it piggybacks a signal on the local broadcast. So for instance, in that region, everyone listens to the Muslim music and prayers at particular times during the day. We could piggyback a signal that generated fear, anxiety, high stressors. And if you remember in that first Gulf War, we had the fourth largest army in the world at the time collapsing like school kids going on their first fire drill. I mean, they just gave up en masse to a handful of troops at certain times, but it was fear and anxiety that was piggybacked on the normal music going in to those regions, music that our troops weren't necessarily listening to. So it was a way to send that in, and this again is probably one of the most insidious forms of warfare when you think about it, because you can do it without any detection. I mean, you don't even have to have troops on the ground. You can use any of these mediums to influencing behavior of very large segments of the population. In fact, it was a Canadian researcher, Persinger, and I believe at Laurentian University, that talked about this in the mid-90s in a paper he published, talking about exactly that all you would have to do is create a complex signal, broadcast it over a large area, create a certain level of dis-ease or anxiety in the population, and then do something as simple as run a normal radio or television broadcast, a press release, indicting some group or some event as the source of your ills. And a certain amount of this public sentiment would then drift that direction. And as we all know in politics around the world, doesn't take much to move an issue an awful long distance. This is a kind of technology that we're talking about here in this century.
Is there any evidence that they've used these types of technologies or same things that they've used against the Iraqi military domestically against protest groups?
Well, there actually was in Great Britain in an issue dealing with public protests back in the 90s. There was a technology used. It was an infrasound device that actually scattered the crowd.
The beam produces an intolerable heating sensation, compelling the targeted individual to instinctively move.
There was another one developed that's been sold actually to the military for perimeter protection, and that was actually won the Lemelson MIT Prize in 2005. Woody Norris, who developed a method of acoustic heterodyning, where he could literally send a signal into a certain zone within an area or space, where anyone walking in that zone would hear that proverbial voice in the head. But the person right next to him, outside of that zone, outside of that target zone, wouldn't hear a thing.
Hypersonic sound works by emitting two highly directional ultrasonic signals at frequencies too high for humans to hear. As these signals mix in the air, however, a column of audible sound is created. Norris envisions using his invention for everything from surround sound units to museum displays.
All of those kinds of illusionary things associated with schizophrenia, you could actually impose on someone, and they would know the difference between the artificially imposed sound signal and that proverbial voice in the head.
In your book, you talk about cyclotronic resonance. What is cyclotronic resonance?
Cyclotronic resonance, again, the idea of the brain being able to lock onto these external signals and actually begin to mirror them. This frequency following response, this idea of being able to lock onto an external signal is taught in every university that teaches psychology at a high level. And they tell you, you can calm a person by flickering light, you can agitate a person, you can create virtually any emotional state. In fact, Delgado at Yale University, starting in the 1960s, worked in this area. By the time he hit the mid-80s, he had figured out that using radio frequency energy, the stuff of HAARP, but at 1/50th of what the Earth naturally produces, which, just to put that in perspective, man produces 200 million times more radio frequency energy than the Earth produces right now around every one of us at this instant. So 1/50th of what the Earth produces is enough to influence the behavior of human beings without any kind of implanted device or mechanical or electronic device attached to a human being, just by manipulating radio frequency energy alone. Now that was mid-80s. Where we've gone from there are great leaps. And when you look at where the research initiatives are being funded by DARPA and others, it's surrounding better ways to get higher and higher resolution. And if you think about it, from the standpoint of computer power and the ability to take a signal and manipulate that signal, just look at the last 30 years in terms of what's happened with computing. And this is where your resolution gets finer and finer and finer and finer, where we're not just looking at gross emotional states, but being able to hone in on specific ideas, thoughts, frameworks, and build those through a technology that the Air Force now refers to as controlled effects, overriding all of the five senses, sight, sound, all of them, overriding them so that they can create complete illusions that you can't separate from an actual memory set. So you imagine synthetic memory. What will that do to the justice system around the world? What will be evidence in 20 or 30 years? And how will you determine what was synthesized and what was really experienced? This is the nature of the technology. A lot of the research is actually even being done in terms of brain research for post-traumatic stress syndrome. How do we wipe these memories out? Now, that's a pretty important technology if you think about the flip side of that. Why would you want to? And what else would you wipe out? And what else could you do with that? And who will do it, and who will determine what goes in your brain, what stays in your brain? And is this the purview of governments? Is this what governments should do? You know, in terms of the legal framework for using technology that would influence human behavior, there really isn't any. I mean, if you think about it, in fact, when we went to the European Parliament on these issues back in the late 90s, that was one of the outgrowths of it. In fact, in their resolution dealing with security and disarmament, which passed, I believe it was January of 1999, is the most comprehensive document ever on security and disarmament, produced by the European Parliament. One of the sections, there were actually 4 sections that dealt with HARP, and then there was a 5th section that we were able to get into the record, which dealt with mind effects, mind control technologies, and that treaty dialogue should begin in this area, that this is an area where there is no treaty. There is a huge gap in terms of where this technology has gone, and the fact that the legal frameworks are not there to protect people on a domestic level or internationally. The Russian Duma passed resolutions in 2002 asking for the same things. The fact is the temptation to use the technology, in fact, you can go back to the politics of the technology, go back to Zbigniew Brzezinski in his book Between Two Ages, and he talked about, quoting from a guy, J.F. Gordon MacDonald, a geophysicist at UCLA, and he said in that book that we would eventually get to the point where we could electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way to return a signal to the Earth that would change the behavior of people over huge geographic areas. This is what HARP can do today. That system can't deliver on that, but so can any other electromagnetic carrier. So you can target individuals or you can target masses of people and affect a huge segment of that population. Things like near field exposures to other signals might dampen it with some people, but on a large scale, the data shows 70, maybe as much as 80% of the population could be influenced by these external causes. The thing is, without legal framework, would the government do it? Absolutely, yes. In fact, in 2006, the Air Force, the United States Air Force, revised their protocols for human experimentation. And on page 9 of that, they actually call out who's authorized on mind control experiments. And they use those words in their document in 2006. And what they say is it has to be approved by an undersecretary of the Navy or Assistant Secretary of the Navy. So someone at that level is the only one, and including issues that would bring about controversies in terms of the media have to be approved at that level. But this is in the current framework of Navy protocols. The experimentation goes on. The Air Force has requests for proposals out. DARPA has contracts that have been let. They all come together under one umbrella with the idea of affecting the human operator. When you talk about the Manchurian candidate kind of concept, you go back to the work of Estabrooks, who started at Harvard's hypnotherapy labs. And what he believed, and his work subsequently in the 30s was classified, but he released information in the 1960s in his published work where he had achieved this, that he had actually created, was able to take somebody into such a deep state of hypnosis and over a 10-month period, literally program in a separate personality, one distinctly separate from the other. So what he could do is you would function like a normal person, but then you could take on this other persona. They could send you in, and the idea was to create the super spy, send you into a country where if they caught you, you'd have no recollection of your former self, but you'd be collecting data. Then you come back, and then they literally extract the data out of you. That was the idea. He said he did it. He claimed over that whole career, going back from Harvard in the 20s until the 1960s, that he achieved it. He was also one of the proponents for using LSD for human behavior modification, something that the MK Ultra hearings in the Church Committee in the 1970s brought out was in fact one of the things that the CIA was doing. They were using hallucinogenics. They were using all kinds of electronics, whatever they thought they could to influence behavior in over 140 sub-projects under MK Ultra. Most of those records were shredded accounting records came to light much, much later that revealed quite a bit of information. In fact, the whole idea of looking at what we used to call PSI or paraphysics or ESP, extrasensory perceptions, were all subject of U.S. Military research, CIA research going back into the 1960s. A lot of the declassified data, over 700 pages of declassified data, we posted on our website just dealing with